Very well, thank you for that introduction, but more importantly for the kind invitation to come and join you here. I've never had an opportunity to visit Israel, and it's a real treat for me. And well, I appreciate the warm welcome. You didn't have to make it this warm. Being Canadian, anything over 30 degrees, we start to melt. If I start to get smaller, that's what's happening up here. Okay? So, as Shirley said, I'm from University of British Columbia, the Center for Inclusion and Citizenship, which is part of the School of Social Work in the university. But we work across, partner with people in law, medicine, psychology, education, on a whole variety of projects. But we focus mainly on issues of policy. Hopefully policy that contributes to the full and equal citizenship of people with disabilities. We also focus on social and ethical issues. So we're doing some work around medical assistance in dying and how that affects disability. So we do quite a broad range, and we're currently doing a big national evaluation of an employment project for people with intellectual disabilities. So it's a fairly broad-based center. My own background in this is really, I was saying to Ronnie that I could have probably just called this talk random thoughts from what I've learned over the last 35 years. But I didn't think that would look so good. So I started back in 1980 when I was a young social worker looking for a very first job. And there was a job in the paper for people to support individuals coming out of provincial institutions, so large congregate care facilities. And I trained actually in community mental health, and particularly, and somewhat bizarrely in retrospect, in arts-based therapy. So I trained in psychodrama, poetry therapy. So I thought, oh, it's be interesting. I'll go work with folks coming out of the institutions. And at that period, psychiatric institutionalization was much further ahead than intellectual disability. And I assumed that's what my job would be. And so I go and I went through the whole interview. I got the job. And I show up at work and meet a young man with an intellectual disability. I thought, wait a minute. I thought I was doing mental health work. So I actually literally got into this work by accident. But was really fortunate that the group I went to work for was a small, very radical organization started by a group of mothers whose kids were all in institution, in a large, at that point, close to 2,000 person institution in British Columbia. They were all kids who had very complex disabilities, so intellectual disabilities coupled with medical or behavioral or other kind of issues. They were the kids that at that time everybody said will always need an institution. And these moms had a different view. They just had a really solid belief that their kids deserved to live in the community and deserved to be part of the community. And started to think about, well, so what do we need to do differently in order to make that happen? And quite organically evolved some concepts which are now fairly standardized in policy across the world, or evolving across the world. And so the first thing they said was, well, the problem we have with our kids is every time we go to the service says they don't fit. They're too this, they're too that. So they're a square peg that's never going to fit in that round hole. So they said, well, our kids don't fit into the services. Maybe we need to find a way to build the services around our kids. And in 1980, that was pretty radical. They said, well, how do we do that? They said, well, the first thing they need is control over the resources. Let's stop giving the money to these services who won't serve our kids and give the money to the families or our kids. So that was really the first iteration of what we call individualized or direct funding in the intellectual disability field. Secondly, they said our kids need somebody who can get to know them, who can understand who they are and what they want and what kind of life they want to build with these resources. And that's where the idea, we called it brokerage, service brokerage at the time, but it's kind of evolved into facilitation. Australia uses something called local area coordinators. But it's kind of evolved into a core function or role in what I would call a new citizenship model around disability. And the third piece was around supported decision-making. And really that was about a very simple problem. It's that our kids don't speak. Our kids don't communicate in any formal fashion. They only communicate expressively. So the only person who's going to be able to understand what they want and what they're trying to tell us are people who know who they are as a person. So I can't teach my students how to recognize when John lifts his right eyebrow, what that means. I can't teach that in a classroom. But his mom will know what that means. His brothers and sisters will know what that means. So we needed to find a way to embed that very organic, expressive process into a way that would be recognized by the system. And that has eventually led to where we're at now. The high watermark would be Article 12 of the UN Convention, which is the right to legal personhood, in other words, the right to make your own decisions, and really practically it expresses itself in what we call supported decision making. So those three little bits were all things that this group of very, very clever moms developed, but developed it from their kids up. They weren't policy experts, they weren't social scientists, they weren't academics. They were moms who wanted a better life for their kids. So what I'm hoping to do today is, sorry, that was a longer introduction than I thought, but I think it's really important to understand what I'm talking about didn't come from the academics. It didn't come from the service world. It didn't come from the professionals. It grew from a very basic belief of a group of moms who wanted a better life for their kids. And I'm happy to say all of their kids now live happily in the community, have done so in some cases now for 35 to 40 years. And that institution closed completely in 1996. Took a while, but so that's kind of a preface. So what I want to do today is, and my own journey has sort of mirrored that. So that was my job, was helping those kids move out and using that process. I then went on to study kind of what the policy tools looked like when we formalized that, and did that for a graduate degree, worked as a kind of policy person for a bit. And then I started to think about, well, why is it we have this group of people that have been excluded from citizenship, that aren't classed as equal persons within our world? So I did my PhD in political theory and philosophy and history, trying to answer that question. So that's where I'm going to start today with. It's kind of a little bit of where I'm at with that. And then I thought I would just take you through, because I've been fortunate that I've been able to follow and consult with a lot of jurisdictions on implementing these policy pieces. So I thought I'd take you on a quick run to where I kind of see those three chunks are at globally. I may have to cut down a little bit. And we meant to say that I'm being good right now, but I'm going to start talking really fast, because I always do. So please, if you're having trouble understanding me, just let me know. Happy to be interrupted at any point for clarifications. I got tenure, so I don't really care what happens anymore, right? And if you don't understand, please ask me for clarifications. And I know that most of you English is not your first language, but feel free to ask a question in English, or you can ask in Hebrew and we can have that translated. But don't be shy. I don't want you sitting there smiling at me going, "Oh, I haven't got a clue what he's talking about, but I'll just sit like this for a while and everything will be fine." Okay. So this issue around social exclusion, because we can't really talk about inclusion until we look at the problem of exclusion. You know, I think the first point that sometimes is glossed over is that, you know, we created this problem of exclusion. People with intellectual disabilities weren't born, sorry, I'm going to focus more on intellectual disabilities, that's my main area, but it applies more broadly, I think, as well. I mean, people weren't born excluded. They weren't born as lesser human beings or lesser citizens. We created that environment. Which the good news is, if we created it, we can take it apart as well. But we have to understand what that looks like. So things like segregated schools, institutionalization, a lot of our policy and programs, I would characterize as ones which force people to exchange rights for services. What I mean by that is that traditional services, group homes, or those sort of things, you're actually exchanging what many of us would consider to be fundamental rights in order to get that service. So you're probably going to have to give up the right to choose who you live with. You're probably going to give up much of the right to choose who supports you in your life. In more extreme cases, you're going to give up the right to decide what you do and when you do it and who you live with, what you eat, how your bedroom's decorated. So really fundamental things about who we are as people, as individuals, are what you give up in order to get services. And I think that's really important that we understand. It's not saying that people who provide services are bad people or they're providing bad services. But structurally, they create an environment which you do have to diminish your citizenship to get the supports you need to function. And that's a really critical piece. This is as a policy specialist, this is a structural problem at heart, and we need to pay attention to that in how we develop our services. So I'm going to go through a little quicker on this, but I just want to point out, particularly in the area of intellectual disability, the idea that people with intellectual disabilities are not just non-citizens, but are non-human, has been one of the core ideas in Western political thought since the very beginning. So this is one example of this. Samuel Pufendorf was actually the person that John Locke took much of his political theory from. John Locke was a great borrower. I mean, he was a brilliant man, and he borrowed really well, but he wasn't massively original. So Pufendorf was actually one of the key influences on Locke, who of course was one of the key foundations of Western political thought. So this is a little quote from him. I left it in the original Old English because I think it looks cool. To make a man capable of giving serious and firm consent is above all things necessary that he be master of his reason. If one is incurably lacking in reason, he is in all legal and moral considerations to be accounted dead. Now, that sounds a little more dramatic than it actually is. When he talks about death or dead, he's referring to an old medieval legal concept called civil death, which essentially meant that you lose your rights as a citizen. So you can no longer participate as a citizen. Traditionally, it was applied to criminals. Okay, once you committed a criminal act, you were declared civilly dead. It's actually a law that's still in place in some U.S. states. You'll still find the concept of civil death in some U.S. states. Remember the big controversy over George Bush when they talked about a lot of the If you had a criminal record, you couldn't vote. That's civil death. It's actually what the concept is still called. So that's what he was referring to. But what was interesting here is this is the first time it was applied to the notion of the intellect. It's the first time that the idea that there was a bar that you had to reach that allowed you to be a citizen. And that's what then carried on through there. And it's the same bar that women were thought not to meet up with. But the whole reason women were excluded from the vote and citizenship was, well, they had reason, as Locke put it, well, they had reason, but it's not the right kind of reason. And it'll just muck everything up when we let them decide on anything. And that, I mean, I don't know about Israel, but in Canada, that law wasn't reversed until the 1920s. Women did not become legal persons before the law until 1926. So it's the same concept, but it has remained very firmly fixed for people with intellectual disabilities. So the point of all that is that it's not an accident that people are excluded. It's a fundamental tenet of Western thought and political theory. So not surprisingly, they've been denied a whole range of rights. I'm going to go a little quicker because I'm taking a little longer than I planned. And you guys, can you make these available to people? Of course. So I'll flip through some, but if you're really interested, you go back and have a look. So, the simple message is the most important thing we can do to end exclusion is to stop creating it. You know, stop segregating kids in schools, stop segregating them in communities, stop putting them in institutions. You know, just stop. Just cut it out, and we can start to repair the damage. On the other side, there are a lot of very specific policy initiatives that we can undertake to start to address some of these deficiencies. I'm going to go into those more fully in a minute. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I see the notions of citizenship and inclusion in relation to one another, because they're often used as the same thing. We talk about inclusion, we talk about citizenship as if they're the same thing. So it was actually not until last year I was doing a series of talks in Australia. And somebody asked me, well, can you talk about citizenship and inclusion as concepts? And I said, oh, given that I named my center after that, maybe that's not a bad idea to think about it. So I started to toy with these ideas a little bit. And you can tell me what you think about where I've gotten to in my fiddling, but here's kind of where I'm at. So the way I define citizenship is the formal structural elements of being equal. Like, so having equal rights and having the support to realize those rights. So obviously the most kind of obvious example would be something like the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. One of the fallacies sometimes my students don't understand about a UN Convention is the UN Convention is not a list of rights of disabled. A UN Convention is a list of what is necessary to realize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for people with disabilities or women or indigenous populations. That's a key difference. So if you look at that convention, it does talk a lot. It's not enough just to say someone has a right. You need to give people the support to realize that right, to make it meaningful. And that's, if you go through the convention carefully, that's what a lot of that's about. You know, what is the hard work we need to do to give meaning to these rights? So that, for me, is citizenship. It's this kind of formal set of rights and equalities that need to be embedded in our laws and structures. Inclusion, for me, is really what I would call the softer side. Probably most of you are too young to really remember the normalization, social role valorization. Is that ringing any bells out there? You know, it focused very much on the valued social roles in everyday life. Okay? It was about being part of your community, being valued in that community. You know, in real simple terms, having friends. Being able to walk down to your local coffee shop and have the guy behind the counter say, "Hi, Bob." So those things sound kind of warm and fuzzy, and to be honest, historically I'm not good on the warm and fuzzy. I'm better on the structure. But at the end of the day, that's what makes our lives, gives our lives value. Right? It's the relationships, the connections, the belongingness. So it's not enough just to give people formal rights of citizenship. We also need to focus on how do we get inclusion. I have a son with an intellectual disability who's 17, so if you do the math, he's not the reason I got into this business. Just one of those strange coincidences in life. And we play this game. We like to do an alphabet game. So we go A, and we'll think of words that start with A, or we'll think of animals. When we come to F, anybody want to guess what word he says first? I won't let you guess the word I think of first. But the word he thinks of first is always friend. And it breaks my heart every time, because the reality is, he's been included in school all thing. He has a lot of kids who know him. He walks into school, there's lots of high gas. But he has no friends. Nobody invites him to come out and do stuff unless it's something we orchestrate. So I can work till I die, which is probably what I'll do, to ensure he has the rights of citizenship, he has the supports in place. But for him, none of that matters if he doesn't have friends. So that's soft and sort of, go ahead.
That's where institutions come in, because especially the people find their group in institutions. So institutions are not necessarily a bad thing, or a secluded mountain.
I think maybe I'll tie your question in parentheses. I think when we use the word institution, in other places it's meant the big places, not like the group homes, which might be what you're thinking of, smaller.
Or even a special class.
Do you mean institutions as a form of service, or institutions in society?
Well, and probably both, which is partly the confusion. So at the early part, when I talked about institutions, I was talking about the big buildings with 1,000 to 2,000 people. More modern stuff, I'm talking about institutions in terms of our policy structures and all that kind of stuff, our political institutions. So,
מוסדות חברתיים, כמו הפוליטיקה, הארגון וכך הלאה, לא מוסדות במובן של מוסד שירות.
But I think also when you will see differences, if I might add, sorry I'm taking your time, between countries, because what we would consider in Israel, unfortunately, as a group home or a hostel might have 16 people. And in some places elsewhere across the world, 16 people is considered big. That's big. So I think we still have a long way to go as well ourselves. So that
we would consider that big.
Yeah. Yes. I know.
For us now, anything over 2 is big. We're actually closing all our group homes. Anyway, that's another story. Maybe we can talk later, because we could be here all day on this one. Okay, so let's get back to this. So you get, in the sense, these two sort of intersecting streams. So really, for me, an inclusive citizenship needs both of these kind of foci and both of these outcomes to have a meaningful impact. Because if we only have the citizenship, it can be a very cold and formal personhood. It's a personhood without meaning, without human connection. if we only have the inclusion stuff, the connection thing, and this is where I would depart fairly dramatically from the SRV normalization theory, that it's actually a highly vulnerable personhood. If you don't have the rights and you don't have the structures and the institutions, you are constantly at the mercy of the state or anyone else. So the two, the one provides the protection, the other, if you like, provides the... So if one is the house, the other is the nice cozy fire you can curl up in front of. So that's kind of the way I've come to view this stuff. And if you look at the UN Convention, I'm not going to go through this, but I kind of just quickly went through that the black is more the citizenship ones, and the blue is more the inclusion ones. So you can even kind of separate it out in the convention, sort of how they're trying to resolve those two issues. So the way I would kind of see, if you like, I think what we've achieved in the last 20 years is we've come a long way in terms of presence. So people are in the community, but we haven't done a very good job helping people become of the community, become part of that community. So in our case, a lot of our group homes, yes, it was on a regular street in a regular neighborhood, but they had no connection with that community. They were still kind of in it, but not part of it. So we need to focus on all of these, but we can work on an accessible environment, and I use accessible in a very broad sense. We need the services and supports for people. Hopefully we'll move on to more economic participation. Things like community contribution. We tend to historically see people with disabilities as the ones we give to and take care of, as opposed to viewing them as people who can also give back and contribute to. So ultimately, we will achieve this relationship and belonging within our communities. So that's just kind of, and I'm still kind of toying with this a bit, but that's sort of where I've gotten to in what I think we're trying to achieve now. Just real quickly, a couple of ways I think the citizenship model differs from other approaches is that firstly, it's not a theory of disability. It's a theory about how do we accommodate or assure that people with disabilities are included in the standard political theories of the West, right? So if we want inclusion, we don't want special theories for special people. We want to make sure that they're embedded within our theoretical concepts. The second is, this one I think is really important. Any political theorist in the group will be familiar with the concepts of the right and the good. But really what we're shifting to is we're not going to be concerned with outcomes so much anymore. Okay, so that would be the good. Right? What we're going to be concerned with now is empowering people to make their own choices and to determine their own lives. And the nature of the outcomes, like for all of us, is really up to them. That for better or for worse, we all have the right to make bad decisions. I'm sure most of you have never made a bad decision in your life. I unfortunately have. But that's a big change, right? Because we spend our life trying to protect people with disabilities and control their choices so that with usually the best of intentions and motivations. But in doing so, we've diminished their personhood. So we need structures that allow us to help them develop the capacities, to help them get what they need to make and act on those choices. But we don't want to be concerned with what those choices are so much. Now, that doesn't mean you abandon people and you let them take risks that are unacceptable for any of us. It doesn't mean you don't advise people and support people. But at the end of the day, it means you let them make a bad choice if that's the choice they really want to make. It's not up to us. Even the idea of saying, let them, is really the phrase we're trying to remove from our vocabulary. Right? And lastly, we're no longer concerned with changing individuals. Right? We're not going to fix them anymore. We're not going to behaviorally condition them to do X. What we're going to focus on is changing our structures and laws and policies that allow them to determine what a good life looks like for them. And that's sort of very, in many ways, classic social model thinking. Okay, so I think I've said all that. So, just before I what I'm going to do next, just to give you a heads up, is I'm going to walk through what I see are the 4 key policy or structural elements of a citizenship-based system. And they're kind of what I mentioned before, the decision-making support, the planning and facilitation support, funding, and governance. But before I do that, any comments or questions on what I've been yammering on about so far? Okay, so either you haven't understood a word of it or you're okay. I'm gonna assume the okay and just carry on. Okay, so as I mentioned early on, these sort of elements, the first 3 certainly grew out of this work of a group of parents, but have now become sort of core policy elements in most Western jurisdictions. And it's been coming for a long time, right? The independent living movement on the physical disability side focused very much on the direct individualized funding of the whole Berkeley collective that evolved. The group I worked with was Community Living Society that started in the late 70s, local area coordination in Western Australia. Things really kicked off in the US with the Robert Wood Johnson self-determination projects and the parallel projects for physical disability and elderly around cash and counseling in the 90s. The UK has a Direct Payments Act in the 90s, and the latest and possibly the grandest scheme is in Australia at the moment, and it's something called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And what it does is restructure the whole cross-disability sector will now be a federal entitlement benefit for supports and services. So you will now have a federal right to that. Well, it's in place now. And you can get the money directly, and you can purchase your services directly or go to a support agency to help you with that. But it's a national, universal, direct funding system. It's a very ambitious scheme, but kind of exciting. So that's a quick history of the evolution here. It's been used pretty much now across most populations, so physical disability, mental health, intellectual disability, seniors. It's been used for families and children, used for adult services. So these models have been applied pretty broadly now in different places. I think I'll skip that because I've probably covered most of this. I know I've covered most of this. So I'm just going to go through each of those 4 areas. So the first one, and one of the more controversial ones, is this, what I would call personal decision-making support. So, and again, the logic of this is fairly simple, right? If we want a system which is based on what people actually want in their life, then the first thing we need to do is help them express that and to give legal authority to that expression. Okay, so there's kind of 2 bits to this. There's, the advocacy supports, the stuff we're familiar with. It's really about helping give people voice, but generally more on a collective level. I'm going to talk more about microboards later. And then there's more the legal, practical piece, which has become known as supported decision making. So really there's kind of 2 key areas of reform on that. And again, this stems from what I mentioned, Article 12 of the UN Convention, which states that all persons are to be considered persons before the law. It sounds weird, but it goes back to that Pufendorf thing, right? They weren't considered persons. So what that means for many people is that our traditional models of guardianship and substituted decision-making are considered in contravention of the UN Convention, which is kind of a challenge for a lot of countries. Now, most countries took a, I can't remember the term, but they put a codicil onto their signing of the convention saying, all right, well, we agree with the convention, but we think Article 12 means we can still keep all this stuff. Right? So it's very controversial. But so basically, from a law reform perspective, the challenge is moving from our traditional systems of substituted decision-making, so guardianship, all of those kind of things, to a model of what we call supported decision-making, where the role of the supporter is not to decide to substitute their judgment for the person, but to support that person and act as an interpreter of their will. Okay? You with me on that? A little bit.
I think I might say in parentheses, just for our Israeli folks, that also here in Israel, just this past March, we changed the line we're trying to move. I know it's late, but we're getting there. From guardianship into this substituted decision making. So this is something that's on top of our current agenda here. So it's very important.
Well, and Israel is not late. Really, almost nobody's got there. And it is complicated legally and practically. It's British Columbia, we had, again, by the same group of parents, we had a very early substitute decision-making law called the Representation Agreement Act. And it's a very simple act that is based not on the traditional, what we call understand the nature and effect basis. So in other words, traditionally to contract or make a decision, the competency test was that you understood the nature and effect of that decision, right, in a very formal way. If you didn't meet that standard, you could have your right to contract or make decisions taken away and shifted to a guardian. What the Representation Act says is that you need a demonstrated relationship of trust between you and your representative. And your representative can then represent you in contract and decision making. But the standard which they're judged to is that they are acting as an interpreter of your will and not as a substitute. So they don't use a best interest standard as you would in substitute decision making. Their standard is one of interpretation. Now in practice that gets really complicated and really mucky, but it's mucky for the right reasons, if that makes sense. Anyway, so different jurisdictions have started moving along. The only two countries that have sort of fully gone this way in law are, I mean, the countries that would first come to mind, Colombia and Bulgaria. I mean, obviously they would be first, right? A lot of US jurisdictions are fiddling with it, Canadian jurisdictions are fiddling with it. Australia is kind of slowly getting there, but nobody's really been able to fully, what most disability activists say would be a full implementation of Article 12. So Israel is not behind. If they're even thinking about it, they're kind of with the pack. And it is complicated. It's particularly complicated. I don't know if your colleague with the mental health specialty is here, but one of the more complicated areas is what do you do with mental health and emergency, what we would call, UK would call sectioning. So if someone is considered to be a danger to themselves or something, you can have a temporary order for hospitalization or those kind of things. Technically, that would contravene Article 12. right? So how do you find a balance which protects the individual and yet respects this, right? So there's a lot of legal complexities. Those of you who like interesting legal policy problems, this is a fun one to work on. So I think I've covered most of these. The biggest problems are that there's no clear legal framework. There's still a confusion between guardianship reform and guardianship elimination or replacement. There is a lack of policy or funding because in order for supported decision-making to work, you need also to reinforce the personal networks around you. And you need to do that in a formal, supported investment kind of way. Because even if folks have family around them, some will still need extra support. But a lot of folks aren't going to have that. And we know one of the key features of having an intellectual disability is to have a very limited social network. So if we don't have the social network, how are we going to find the people to support people in making decisions that know them? So we need to be very intentional in investing and building those relationships, because that's the core of the supported decision-making model. So that's just some of the challenges on piece number one. And there's a lot more. I'm not going to deal with all of those. One of the things conceptually is moving beyond our traditional concept of capacity, which is a very limited, narrow notion, into notions of what we call relational capacity, which is a growing kind of theoretical area of inquiry that basically says our traditional model is very atomistic, very much about autonomy of the individual, and capacity is only assessed based on that one person and their one abilities. Relational autonomy says no, our autonomy and our capacity is based as much on our interrelationships as our individual stuff. So real simple things, most of us when we have a big decision to make, we consult our trusted others, right? We consult our spouses, our friends, our children, and expert advisors that we trust, right? That's relational capacity. That's what increases our ability to make good decisions and understand consequences. And our legal system being very much based on a strict individual system kind of has trouble building this into law, and yet ultimately that's what has to happen for supported decision-making to work. Okay, how am I doing on time?
11:20.
What time am I supposed to end? Oh, I got lots of time.
But you'll give us some time.
But I will have time for questions. Okay, well, I'll start talking fast now. So the next bit is the more technical. So the first bit is about helping people express their will, to say what they want, because that's what we want to base the system on. The second bit is more about the technical. And I'm sure you're very familiar with concepts like person-centered planning and those kind of things. That's really what this piece is about, is how do we technically understand what a person needs and translate that into services and supports, right? So that's kind of the job of, in our case, usually social workers. Their job is to listen to what the person wants and interpret that in a way the service system understands. Okay? And can turn that into budgets and all of those sort of things. And that's this role of a broker. And the reason we called it a broker was, the analogy was to a stockbroker or to a real estate broker. So when you want to buy a house, you go to your broker, right? You go to your real estate agent and you say, all right, we want kind of a house with this many bedrooms and these kind of features in this area. and at this price. Your broker then goes off and says, oh, well, you know, you're not going to find anything in this area with those descriptions, but these are your choices of what you could get. Or he says, all right, well, here's 4 options that I think meet your criteria. Come and have a look and decide which one you want. What he doesn't do is say, okay, here's your house. Right? He doesn't choose your house for you. He provides his expert advice and support to help you choose. And that's exactly the model we want to apply in human services. So that your role is not to decide what services a person needs, but to understand what they want in life and to figure out what kind of supports they need that can make that happen, and let them make the choice about what that looks like. So that's really this brokerage facilitation type supports. The key point here, and it's not up here of course, is that it's a bit of a change in traditional social work roles and stuff, is because the one thing you are not is a decision maker. And as soon as you are a decision maker, you can no longer be a fair broker. It's actually illegal for stockbrokers to do that, right? And it's illegal for a reason, because it harms your interest as a person. And it's no different in the human services world. I won't go into these other details in the interest of time. So, supporting people to express their will, giving them technical support to implement that will and move towards their good vision of a life they want. Thirdly is around the funding. These families very quickly realize whoever controls the funding is the one who really has the power. Right? So for me, individualized funding is defined with 2 key points. And again, for me, this is an important distinction. But firstly is it's individualized in that the amount of funding is determined in reference to that specific individual's disability-related needs. Okay, we're not going to give everybody everything they want. We're only going to fund what is a legitimate claim on the state, which is the disability needs. But we're going to figure that out for each person, as opposed to saying, right, disability support are $2,500 a month. Because not everybody has the same needs or support. So that's the first piece. And the second piece is that how they are spent is determined by that person or their family and network around them. So it's individualized in these 2 sort of key ways. So this is just a picture of what a traditional model looks like. So this is what they call a traditional block funding model with a funding agency, which is usually the government, right? They fund the service provider agency, who then provides support to the individual. So the question you need to ask yourself is, who is the least powerful actor in that diagram? Yeah. So what traditionally happens is if the service doesn't actually meet the person's need, the person has 2 choices. They can either not fully have their needs met and put up with that service, or they get nothing. Okay? So that's problematic from a lot of perspectives, not just the least of which that it's less likely to result in people getting the life they actually want. It's also going to make people very vulnerable. So that a lot of families will tell you that, you know, I'm not really happy with this group home and it makes me a little nervous, but I don't have a choice because I can't have them home. So they're willing to put up with situations that they know are not ideal and may be potentially dangerous to that individual because they have no right of exit. And they have no right of exit because they have no control over the resources. So that's kind of a traditional model of how we fund things. So what we're trying to do in a self-determination model is switch that all around. So the funder is now going to fund that individual directly based on this person-centered planning process. They, supported by a facilitator or broker if necessary, are then going to determine who it is they want to provide those services. And it might be an agency, it might be hiring directly to personal assistants, and certainly in the UK experience of direct payments model, most people with disabilities prefer just to hire directly, not to use agencies. Or, and this is the bonus side, is they might go to more commercial generic providers that traditionally are not seen as disability support people, but actually do the job they want, right? So, another quick analogy, not an analogy, I suppose, it's a story. There was a guy who was coming out of the institution that I was working with. Very complex disability, lots of behavior things. He was a big guy, very loud. He wanted to go swimming, right? He liked to swim. So our choices were, well, we can put him in a special swim program, special time, special pool, special people. Or we can figure out why he can't go swimming in the pool in the neighborhood that we were going to. So my job was to go to the local rec department and say, hey, I got this guy who wants to come swimming in your pool, but right now he can't because X, Y, and Z. Do you think we could work together to get rid of those barriers so that he can use his local pool like everybody else at the same time as everybody else? In that particular case, we had a fabulous rec person who was in charge of the pool, and not only could Brock, my buddy, could use the pool, but so could hundreds of other people who came after him. So the other advantage to this model is it allows us to change our community, right? Because we're going with resources, we're going with some authority, and we can actually change the generic world at the same time. I'm not going to go into this in great deal. I think I did a little bit. There's lots of variations on a theme for all this stuff. Lots of countries are implementing it in various different ways. I talked about the Australia model is the big one. The UK has been going for quite a while. The US has some really interesting models in different states and different approaches. I'm going to skip through this. Fairly big. I've done a bit of there hasn't been a huge amount of cost-benefit analysis on this stuff done, but I've done a little bit and looked at what else is out there. Generally what we find in the research that's been done is that this kind of model generally is no more expensive than a traditional model. It can in some cases be cheaper. In some cases it might be a little bit more expensive. But overall research suggests it's not, if done properly, it's not a more expensive model. But on a cost-benefit basis, user satisfaction is much, much higher with this model than with the others. So in other words, you're getting, we would say in North America, you get more bang for your buck with this approach. This one's kind of interesting, because when they started, a lot of countries will say this, well, how can we give money to families? They might buy a Porsche or go to Hawaii. And actually what the research tells us is that families are much more efficient with the money than agencies. Because it's about their family member, it's about their kid. So they're going to make sure they squeeze every ounce of value out of those dollars. And so they're actually tend to get more for it. And one of the weird things that's happened early on in these implementations is that in several jurisdictions, families found they didn't need all the money they got because they used it very carefully and wanted to give it back. And both in the UK and in my own province of BC, the government said, oh, we don't have a system for you to give it back. That's never happened before. So what they did in BC was the families got together and formed a little agency, a family co-op agency, where families had extra direct funding dollars, put it into this agency, and any family in the province could apply to that for things that weren't covered. So stuff like, if you have a child that's incontinent, and your washing machine breaks. I don't know how many have had kids, adults that are incontinent or older kids. Washing machines are the most important thing in your house. And it's not something you can wait 6 months to get a government-approved grant to get it. So they would do stuff like that. And because they were small and just family to family, it was really informal. Families call up, provide a little bit of information, and they could get the washing machine that same week. So it was kind of a cool, very sort of organic sort of stuff. Anyway, so that's just a quick on cost. I'm going to skip the rest of the cost stuff. You know, if you're really interested, we have multiple models in BC, so we were able to get copies of every contract, individual contract, for each of the types of models and do a fairly detailed cost analysis on these. So if you're really interested, you can find this study on our center website. The boring stuff. And the fourth piece I'm not going to really talk much about, but it's really a new one. It's around governance. That you know, if we're truly about empowering people and people making choices, then we need to give them meaningful roles in the governance of our organizations. Right? So making sure they're part of our boards and supporting both, like in the US, Canada, and Australia, there's some small but really interesting kind of family, self-managed organizations that are worth looking at, kind of supporting these very small, organic kind of groups. But yeah, governance, I'll tell you one more quick story. Well, it won't be my last story. I hope it'll be quick. I was involved in redesigning the support system for developmental disability in British Columbia. So our goal was to move it out of government into a Crown agency. That makes sense to you? It's like a quasi-government agency that is kind of arm's length from government. So we were designing this agency, and we were putting most of those elements into this. And we came to the governance piece and said, all right, let's put in the legislation that the board of this Crown agency, which is now responsible for funding all the supports and services for disability, so about $800 million entity. We put in the legislation that the board had to have 50% plus one people with disabilities or family members. Of all the things we were trying to do, the government freaked out most about that. They said, well, how can a person with an intellectual disability possibly run a $800 million organization, or a family member do that? And our response was, well, how can a bunch of lawyers and accountants possibly know what people with intellectual disability want, yet you're quite willing to let them run this organization? Don't we need both? And our second response was, well, surprising as it may be to you, people with disability have family members who are lawyers, accountants, doctors, academics. We're not just people with disabilities family members. But, so we got it in the legislation. That was the hardest piece to get in. As soon as we all went away and the government was responsible for it, within 2 years they took that line out of the legislation. So it's a really hard thing for people to accept. Okay, I'm gonna tell you a story, and then I'm gonna show you a video, which I think tries to weave most of this stuff together. And I think pretty close to where I'm gonna stop. Are we still okay? All right, so let me tell you my favorite story. Which hopefully describes how all this kind of fits together. So, 1980, I was asked to work with a young man in the institution who was considered behaviorally one of the most challenging people in that institution. He could become physically violent. He was a big guy, my size. And he had a behavior called pica. Familiar with the behavior pica, putting stuff in your mouth? What he would put in his mouth was cigarette butts. He was addicted to cigarettes, but residents weren't allowed to smoke. but the staff were. So when we started to look at what he was doing was busting his way into the staff room to grab cigarette butts to chew on to feed his nicotine addiction. But of course, the way that was interpreted in the institution was that he was violent and aggressive, would attack staff, and then they would put him in the quiet room, and everything sort of escalated. But if you actually looked at what he was trying to say to us, what he was telling us was he was addicted to nicotine and nobody would give him nicotine. So, one of our ways we approached this in these cases, we didn't actually spend much time in the institution. We didn't actually even look at the files before we spent time with people. We sort of said, all right, tell me what I need to know from a safety and security standpoint. That's all we want to know at this point. We're not going to read acres of reports and assessments. We're going to spend time together. So we would spend time out in the community because that's where we were trying to get to, right? So we need to know, we needed to give him a chance to tell us about what he wanted in that. So we used to go to McDonald's a lot. Now in those days in Canada, you could smoke in McDonald's. So Dennis and I are sitting there in McDonald's. All of a sudden Dennis jumps up and he runs across the restaurant. And he pulls a lit cigarette out of this guy's mouth, pops it in his mouth, and then comes back. Of course, poor guy sitting there. The whole restaurant's kind of thinking, okay, that could be a problem for Dennis's community integration. We might have to think about this problem. So Dennis was actually deaf. The institution didn't figure out he was deaf until he was 14. So he had never been given a chance to learn much sign language, but had just started learning it. So we thought about this and said, all right, well, if nicotine's the problem, let's find a way for him to solve that problem, right? So we just taught him to, I want tobacco, please. And we got chewing tobacco. So now instead of running across McDonald's and pulling lit cigarettes out or busting through the staff to get his nicotine, all he had to do was ask. And we had chewing tobacco. Now, lots of people say, whoa, what the health effects? Yeah, we'll worry about that at some point in the future, all right? The behaviors didn't disappear overnight, but they dropped dramatically and gradually disappeared, right? Because we listened to him, we let him tell us what he wanted, and we responded and were able to find services to do that. So the other piece for Dennis, he moved into quite a nice house. And that night I get a call from a very frightened overnight staff who was about this big. Dennis is trashing his room. And he was. Pretty dramatically. So, okay. Clearly Dennis is trying to tell us he's not fully happy with this in a very dramatic way. Because we had the individualized funding, and because we could move quickly, I was able to move him out the next day into an apartment of his own with a one-to-one worker that knew sign language and could take the time to help him, to let him tell us what he did want. So we spent about 3 months in that setting. And then we had set up a 3-person group home, but for only 3 people. And everyone in the house was deaf, and all the staff were deaf. And the language of that house was sign language. And it had all the TTY devices, the telephone for the deaf, and all the communication devices. So he was doing pretty good there, things were going well. And down the line I get this call, again, from a rather frightened staff member. Dennis is gone. I said, oh, okay, that's a problem. Where did he go? We don't know. Oh, where does he like to go? McDonald's! Of course, McDonald's, right? So there's McDonald's about 3 blocks up from his house. I said, well, have you checked McDonald's? No. I said, well, check McDonald's. So they go up there, and there's Dennis sitting in McDonald's with a hamburger, French fries, and a Coke. Happily eating his little lunch. And so they asked the people at the counter, well, how did he do that? He said, well, he came in, he was kind of agitated, and he kept going. And they're looking at him like, what's that? And one of the other staff people at McDonald's said, oh, that's Dennis. That means I want a hamburger, french fries, and a pop. And they gave him his hamburger, french fries, and a pop. They wisely did not wait for him to pay for it. But what I love about this story, so here's a guy who's basically seen his big behavior problem, locked up, and now was in his community. It was not just in his community, he was now teaching his community. He had taught that McDonald's worker how to sign language at a very basic level, but also she had learned to understand him, and it was really that process of integration. So the only way we could do that were with all those structural elements, right? So listening to him, having someone who could interpret that into a technical system way, and having the flexibility through the individualized funding to respond very quickly and change as he expressed his will. So that's one little story of kind of how all that sort of fits together in a structural sort of way. Dennis is still living in the community, doing very well, and that's in 1981 he moved out. So I'm just going to show you a little video to illustrate another version of this. This is a little more modern one. I thought we left it up. Oh, it's on there, yeah. Oh, there it is, great. So this is just a short clip of a mom talking about using direct individualized funding kind of supports for her son. And what I like about this bit, this is a First Nations woman. And it talks about how not only has this allowed her son to integrate the community, but it's also allowed him to reconnect with his culture. It's kind of a neat, that inclusion citizenship thing again.
אפשר לראות את האור ולהפעיל את המזגן? את החור?
Lucky I didn't touch it deep. What we're trying to get sound. This is a whole series of short videos around inclusion and citizenship on different aspects. I think we're up to about 60 little short clips. This is all available free on my center's website. If you're interested, just kind of trawling through them, and you're welcome to use them however you want to use them. Is that not going to work?
Okay, there's somebody else there.
What?
There's somebody at the desk.
Well, we try to bring this up. It's a good idea if we can put questions at this time.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Questions until we try to see if we can get this to work.
Looking for a very interesting, I think this overall view on all those aspects is very impressive and interesting, and I think also what you did yourself at the center in terms of this shift. This is a huge story, very inspiring. you talked, in your talk, you talked about many issues of policy change, but also when you presented your model, the model of citizenship was about rights and equality and then realization. And my students here, we really try to think about realization in terms of taking up rights, taking up rights that people already have through policy or law. Can you elaborate a little bit about that, the aspect of taking up, especially if there are special features that are especially relevant? We know that there are barriers to taking up social rights.
Yeah.
Can you, if you can elaborate about, is there something special there that we should think of when thinking about taking up by people with disability?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a big question. I think one of the key things for this, for me anyway, is recognizing that personal networks and those connections are no longer luxuries, and that they actually are essential pieces to the realization of these rights. So therefore, I believe they should be funded as such. Now, how we do that, and you guys might know more from the state. So we talked about building networks and connections, and nobody's really come up with a great way of doing that yet. But ultimately, say, we can give them these rights on paper, but to realize them, for many people, the vehicle is that connectedness. And so for me, I was going to focus on one thing around the realization. After we got the technical bits in place, that would be it for me.
That makes sense. And often, I think that will be often the answer of social work, which lawyers or other more legalistic, bureaucratic kind of thinking won't have a clue about.
Misha is a lawyer.
Yeah.
I'm a converted lawyer.
But on the other hand, my frustration with my social work students is they don't understand the rights and the structural pieces. And I'm saying, you can have all the dedication and ethics and values and enthusiasm you want and still really screw people up if you don't understand the policy structure. Because I teach the policy courses, and they all kind of come to, oh yeah, we gotta go to policy. I'd really like to do interviewing skills. And so I think it works both ways. Okay, so we got this?
We got this, and we have 9 minutes.
Maybe we'll skip that, and let me just
send it.
The link is on the PowerPoint. It's on.
Whoever wants to stay also in the half an hour break, I think we can put it on in between. And I can send it to you as well, because I think some people, I saw some hands up, and some people want to chat.
אפשר לקטור.
ואת המזגן?
Whoever turned it off, have to turn it back on.
המזגן עובד.
And I'll just say that, sorry, the latter bit, there's something called microboards. How many people have heard of microboards? Anybody? Microboards are a really cool little system that evolved in BC. It's about 1,200 now, which kind of put all this together, the personal network, the facilitation, the funding can be directed through them. And what they are is they're little like mini agencies for one person. So they're formally registered agencies, but they only support one person. And they build this little board, and they've been able, to my mind, do the best job of integrating that citizenship inclusion elements. Quietly been very effective. So there's another bit on that, and another video about those that you can look at.
Anyone who will want the link to the PowerPoint or to the videos, you will give us your email and we'll make sure to give it across. Okay. Anything you want, most anything you want. Question in the back.
אם אפשר בעברית, האנגלית שלי עדיין...
Asking Hebrew.
במודל אני רוצה לדעת אם יש הגדרה לכמה תקציב הולך לטובת הקשרים בקהילה, התמיכה הקהילתית. זה די ברור כמה הולך לכל אחד באופן אישי, כמה הולך למשפחה וכמה המשפחה חשובה, והסינגור עצמי הוא חשוב. לא כל כך ברור לי מה הייתה ההגדרה כלפי היעדים הכספיים שלה הולכים לקהילה, כדי שהקהילה כן תהיה בעצם, כמו שהוא אומר, התוצר הסופי זה בתוך הקהילה, ההתערות בתוך הקהילה, ולא ברור לי שם במודל כמה מתוקצב שם.
She's asking, the end product is community involvement and being in the community, just like we showed in the model. And the question is if there are any guidelines or anything written out or guidelines of how much of the budget actually will reach. So it might be clearer how much budget will go to the family or other places, but do we know how much budget will go to doing exactly those things within the very practical. And maybe I can add in parentheses to this question, but it might be a different question. For me, the fact that you said it's going to be cost effective was convincing. The problem is how do we take this to the policy level, because I'm thinking people out in the policy level are not going to be so convinced that it's going to be cost effective for them.
Yeah, and there's probably enough evidence now to give you that piece. Australia did, obviously, before they implemented this huge national, did a lot of work. So yeah, governments are always skeptical, but I think we're kind of at a point where we have enough to make the case. What I do advise people is don't say it's cheaper, right? Because generally it's cost neutral would be my best. But back to your point, it varies so much between jurisdictions. In BC, it kind of whacks and wanes year to year budget. So what they will do on this sort of $800 million is they will earmark some money where they will fund projects. So, whether it's friendship projects or community inclusion projects, they will do that. But the more critical part is on when you're negotiating your direct funding, as we call them in our system, you can have budget line items for what we call community inclusion funding, which is often usually about that making connections. And you need to spell it out in your plan what that's going to look like, and then you can actually submit that as a line item in your individualized budget. But it would vary from person to person.
Is that okay?
What's your name?
Nurit. I would like to hear more about your thoughts about inclusion and policy in education. You were talking about adults, and I'm asking about the basics of children and inclusion in the schools. Because
really,
I think we have very similar questions there.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's our next speaker's expertise. I'm not an educationalist, so beyond saying, and for me it's more a belief than a research or a scholarly view, it just makes so much sense, right? That I grew up at a time when kids with disabilities were either in special schools or in a special class. So what message did I get growing up? The message I got was these people were different, possibly slightly dangerous, were people who weren't supposed to be with me, and that's the message I carry through life. Whereas as my son's class, the kids in his class, they don't think twice about it, that he's part of that class, because that's what they've grown up with. And the hope is that once they're in the community, they're not going to think twice about him being part of their community. Now that's a high level of experience. Our other speakers are much more qualified to address that, but for me, that's the most important thing. I don't give a, what, if he learns math or spelling or physics. What I care about is that he's in that classroom with those other kids, and that the social learning that's going on is happening.
we would love to have a separate conversation with anybody who's interested in inclusion from the educational standpoint. We're going to be talking after the break about self-determination, so we won't be specifically dealing with that, but my colleague Renata Tika and I are both from the University of Minnesota's Global Resource Center on Inclusive Education, and we deal with those questions all the time. Complex questions. I don't want to take up Tim's time because I could spend a day just talking about those, but we would love to talk to you about those at some time during break.
Thank you.
Being a parent, I have a 19-year-old daughter with cerebral palsy. I know, talking to other parents as well, that a biggest anxiety is what will happen after kids won't be around anymore. And I also know that there are many parents that love to see their kids out of hostels and institutions. They're very afraid of the security and how secure their kids will be living in a community. And I wanted to ask, did you address this kind of fears and thoughts? And did you think, for example, did you look into the possibility of special funds? For example, when you said that families get money and don't use all of it, did you think about special funds that will secure the future of these kids in the community in the future?
Yeah, and that's a universal fear of parents, right? That if you ask anywhere in the world what parents' biggest fear is, what's going to happen after. Now, I don't have time to go into it because there are some really interesting models that are basically, and microboards is one example. So how do we build a network that's bigger than you and dad or sister that can sustain through it? And how do we give them the legal tools to be able to do that? And we've got several tools in law in BC now. If you Google something called Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network, PLAN for short, that's their whole focus, is giving families some assurance that their child will be supported in a way that is the way they want and by the people they want doing it, and that they'll have the legal tools to do it. And that's a lot of technical stuff around wills and trusts and all that stuff, so I won't go into that now. On the other question in terms of that fear, yeah, and virtually, I've been involved in deinstitutionalizations now in several different countries. Almost always initially families' reactions is that fear, right? What's going to happen? And you have to take that seriously. And that's the first point, that we tend to get caught up in our rhetoric, obviously this is the best thing, and dismiss that as opposed to working that respectfully through with families and helping them see it. The way we did it was we took families out to visit folks in the community, went to houses, let them see. But two other points, and I don't want to cause any panic here. Thinking your kids are safe in places they are now is often a huge mistake, and one that we allow ourselves to make because it's the only way we can live with ourselves. And really, the evidence is pretty clear that the larger the setting, the more likely the risk of abuse is, right? So that's the first point that we used to very gently talk to families about. But absolutely, there is no institution in the world that if you scratch the surface, you're not going to find abuse, right? Just, they don't exist. So that's the first piece. Second is being able to maintain that control is the key point there. So a lot of our families and the microboard families, they hire and fire the staff, right? So they are able to have control over that level if they don't trust somebody. And that's ultimately what it is. You're trusting someone with your son or daughter's life. You should have say in who that is. Unfortunately, in a lot of our bigger technical systems, you have very little control over that. If it's a highly unionized environment, I can give you chapter and verse of people who it has been proven committed acts of abuse, but because of the complications of getting rid of them, they get moved to another ward, right? So having that control and the ability, that right of exit thing I talked about, it's hard to get there. And to me, the only way you can do that is they take the time to walk through with families, to show them, to let them see for them, and most importantly, talk to other families. Because what they will say is, I felt the same way, and this is how we dealt with it, and this is where we're at now. A social worker or me is never going to convince you. Parent to parent is where it's going to be effective. But I don't know if that helps.
I know there are some other questions, but we also need time for a break, and I know some people need to run out of class. So, first of all, thank you, Tim. Great, and it's not by chance that there are other questions, because you inspired your many questions to come up. Tim is going to be here. I hope he's not running out. And if you have personal questions, you can also have this chance to be asking him right outside of the door. And Brian and Renata are staying for another lecture, but are also here for those specific questions that came up. There is some coffee outside that you can have until 12:30. I promise to say that no one brings any coffee or food inside this room. So you have enough room outside. And it's 12:30, we're coming back here. And I urge you, I know some of you have classes. You can tell them I told you not to go. Come back, stay with us, and there's going to be a very exciting session afterwards.
And I will say, I hit my email or send me the contact information. Feel free to contact me anytime if you have questions or you're trying to track down anything I've talked about.